Hey guys, kinggath here, and in this guide we're going to talk about the different types of settlements that exist in the game once you have Conqueror installed. So the first type is the basic settlement. This is a settlement that doesn't have any faction associated with it. It would just be the generic game before you installed Conqueror. If you didn't use NukaWorld, all of your settlements would be of this basic type. Now, the big reason to mention this particular type is that by default, all settlements that aren't of one of the other three types are ignored by Conqueror for its raid mechanics. So Conqueror comes with its own raid system, which we'll talk about in other videos. And if you leave a settlement alone as the basic type, you don't have to worry about Conqueror ever doing anything with it in that regard. So you won't have to worry about it messing with your existing settlements that you control. So it's going to leave those alone. They're considered kind of outside of this system until you decide to get them involved in it. The next type is the Outpost type, and outposts are the type where your soldiers live. So when you initially established your empire and placed down a war planner's desk and conquered it for a faction, it becomes an outpost. And an outpost can house your different soldiers. An outpost is also used as the location of origin for an assault. So when you start going and running attacks, which we'll cover in another video, you will do so from within an outpost, and that outpost will be the source of where the majority of the soldiers come from for that assault, although they're not limited to that. We'll talk about that again in another video, and you're gonna hear me say that a lot, talk about it in another video. And it's also the source of a lot of the benefits that go to those soldiers that go on there. So when we talk about the different special plot types Conqueror includes, there are a lot of combat bonuses and things that happen on raids, and leader traits that happen on raids. All of that is based on the outpost of origin for an attack. Another thing to know about outposts is that they are less efficient at generating resources that for the soldier needs, so the wages, the rations, and the equipment, than the other type of settlement we're going to talk about, which is vassals. There's actually a fourth type, which I'm going to talk about now before we get into vassals, and that's your main base. And your main base is effectively your first outpost, though you can change it to another outpost later by a method I'll show you in another video. But your main base, the primary differences between that and a general outpost is that your main base by default will generate 50 of each resource. So it'll generate 50 wages, 50 rations, and 50 equipment. This number is very important because it represents the number you would generally need for 5 soldiers, and 5 soldiers is the minimum you need to run attacks. So by default, if you have a main base, you will always be able to expand your territory without having to build anything else. So the idea is you always have your main base to fall back on if things fall apart. If you start losing control of your settlements during the hostile takeover system or whatever other mechanics we introduce over time, you always will have your main base to fall back to, and it will be able to rebuild your army from scratch. And in addition to that bonus of plus 50 to each of the resources, it's also unclaimable, so no other faction can take out your main base. Now, it's possible we change this with future mechanics, but in general, the idea is you are always going to have that to fall back on so that you don't have to start over from scratch as a one-man army. We don't want you to ever get into that situation where you'd be forced to go kill everyone by yourself. We want you to always have a place you can safely rebuild from. So it might be that an enemy force comes in and wipes out all your soldiers at your main base, but they aren't going to stick around and control it. Instead, they will leave, and you will be able to rebuild again from it. So your main base is basically an outpost with some special benefits to make sure that it's always your central point where you can rebuild from. All right, the last type we're going to talk about are the vassals. And the vassals are effectively a settlement that you have either bent to your will or has allied to you for protection, depending on what type of faction you're playing with. We'll talk about liberators and conquerors in another video, but they effectively mean liberators are your good guys, conquerors are your bad guys. So a typical type would be the conqueror would be the raiders. They are going to dominate the farms in the area to work for them and send them resources and tribute for them, whereas a good guy faction liberator might be the Minutemen, who are likely going to convince settlements to ally with them and get a chunk of resources in exchange. Now, generally, the way you work with with vassals is you use those as your method to supply your outposts. So they are more effective at producing resources. So by default, all of their plots, their agricultural, commercial, and industrial plots will generate way more resources than those in an outpost. So it's always more effective to generate your resources from vassals. But there are some consequences to that. You have to have a specific score called control over your vassals, or you will lose control of them, and we'll talk about that in another video. But there are mechanics in play to make sure that you aren't just wanting to spam one or the other. It's always a balance. Now, the balance isn't necessarily one-to-one in vassal and outpost. It really depends on how you design things and how you optimize your soldier roles, which we'll talk about again in another video. Did I mention I'm going to be saying in another video quite a lot? But the soldier roles can have a big impact on that as well. So it's there's lots of room to play. We try to give you ways to role play whatever you want, but there are all these intertangled mechanics to make sure that you have to make some interesting decisions as you go. So vassals effectively are your resource providers. Your outposts are your place to bunk your soldiers and run your attacks, and that's the primary differences between them. And then your main base is your special outpost that you can only have one of. It generates resources by default and can never be lost. So I think that should cover you guys, and now you should be ready to learn about raids so you can make decisions for whether you should make vassals or outposts. So you'll learn about that in the next video.